Hi there again, everyone. Tom Funk here from Tom's Trail Tales, also author of 50 Hikes in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and 50 Hikes on the North Country Trail. Today, I'm going to share with you a presentation I did for a Quiet Water Symposium during the COVID lockdowns where we couldn't get together and we were doing online presentations. So it seems like the Quiet Water Symposium, we're not sure if it's going to take place next year or not. So I thought this is a good time for me to put this on YouTube so a wider audience can enjoy it. So, my current book project is Almost Forgotten Paddles, Portages, and Pathways of the Western Great Lakes. And I've been working on this project since the start of the pandemic when I really didn't have much to do and I was stuck at home. Been researching this, and it's been a pretty interesting project. And I'd just like to share with you some highlights of what I have found out so far. But first, a brief history lesson. Glaciers, they shaped our landscape here in Michigan for thousands of years, and the last glaciers retreated around 13,000 years before the current era or 15,000 years ago from today's date. So keep in mind that our landscape and many of the trails and waterways that we use were most definitely influenced by glacial activity. I would also like to strongly point out that our indigenous peoples, Native Americans, were here in Michigan for 10 to 12,000 years before Europeans came on the scene. So when you hear so and so discovered Lake Michigan or so and so discovered the Muskegon River, they're referring to European discovery because the Native Americans, indigenous, have been here for thousands of years. And if it weren't for them living on the landscape, they created the footpaths and the waterway routes and the portages that we took for granted. And frankly, today, a lot of our roads on highways, expressways, things like that are actually parallel or next to or near a lot of these old routes. So keep that in mind when you're driving down one of our expressways in Michigan. So, first contact is a phrase that we use when we mean Europeans coming in contact with Native Americans. It's the first contact Native Americans have had with Europeans. Of course, the first contact that we mostly recognize is Columbus in 1492. In the Great Lakes, we had Champlain, and before him, we had Jacques Cartier up the St. Lawrence. But Champlain came into contact with Lake Huron in 1615 with Etienne Brule. And the reason why they were here is they were looking for the Northwest Passage, or a route to China and India. Keep in mind that European merchants were going around the Horn of Africa or across the Levant to get to the Arabian Gulf to continue on to India and China. So they knew that the earth was round and they were looking for maybe a shorter way without having to go through the hassle of going all the way around the tip of Africa or going overland through the Levant to get back onto water again. But what they found instead, beaver. Lots and lots of beaver. And at the time in Europe, beaver was pretty much disappeared off the landscape. It was a very popular resource, and the French saw an opportunity to collect beaver and bring them back to Europe. So they started exploring the Great Lakes and into Canada, up in the North Country. I have a map on here of the Great Lakes Watershed. You can see the little green line going through Michigan's Lower Peninsula. You see two of them. It splits just north of Ann Arbor. Around Saginaw Bay, that is the Lake Huron watershed. Of course, you got the Lake Michigan watershed on the west and Lake Erie watershed in the UP. You've got the Lake Superior on the north part of the UP. Michigan on the south part of the UP, and a little chunk over on the eastern end of Upper Peninsula. Now, these watersheds, the water flows and I'll use the Saginaw Bay and the Huron watershed and Lake Michigan watershed. So the water flows from that green line towards Lake Huron, or from that green line and towards Lake Michigan. So it's important to know that the rivers themselves didn't necessarily connect, with some very few exceptions. So if you were crossing Michigan, you'd have to get out of your canoe in a lot of cases and carry it across the landscape, put it in another river. So Native Americans for thousands of years were looking for the quickest and easiest way to connect these waterways through portaging, and that's what we call it today, is portage or portaging. So our first exploration that found Michigan was Etienne Brule. Like I said, he came into contact with Lake Huron with Champlain at approximately 1615. And then he came to what is today's Sault Ste. Marie, St. Mary's River and Rapids. And there's dates all over the place between 1618 and 1621. I tend to go with 1620. When he came to the St. Mary's River and discovered many Native Americans fishing there. Cool trivia question. Michigan was discovered before Massachusetts was, because the Mayflower landed in the fall of 1620, and Brule found the Upper Peninsula in the midsummer of 1620. So it's an interesting trivia question. All right, so there's a lot of debate whether or not Brule made it into Lake Superior or not. There's stories that he actually circumnavigated. The man had disappeared off the landscape for a few years. The thing is, Brule was illiterate, and all we have are his stories told to a couple biographers, and we have to glean information from there. So the French continued to explore. We had Jean Nicolet, who was the first person to, or first European to traverse through the Straits of Mackinac, and he went down into Green Bay. It is not known if he actually made it to the Mississippi watershed or not. We think he came close, but not quite to the Mississippi watershed. The Jesuits are Roman Catholic priests who tagged along with explorers. So these explorers would come into the Great Lakes. They bring some Roman Catholics, and they kind of they help them out. Also, these priests were trying to convert the savage soul over to Christianity and Catholicism. So it was Isaac Jogues and Charles Rainbow that in 1641 founded a mission at Sault Ste. Marie, which was abandoned soon afterwards. So that was like the first European settlement, although it was not permanent at Sault Ste. Marie. Another interesting trivia question. Isaac Jogues is the only saint that served in the state of Michigan. And you can Google and look up and read his biography. And if you look at his hands, you'll want to read the biography, because it's just amazing what this man went through serving the Catholic Church. So before Radisson, who's a famous French explorer, there was Groseilliers. And Groseilliers is actually his brother-in-law. Groseilliers did a little tour from Montreal, and he somehow found his way from Lake Huron in Detroit all the way over to the west shore of Lake Michigan. He did not take any notes. Speculation on what route he took. You can see the red line. Some folks said he took the Huron to Grand River route, which is probably very unlikely, because the portage between those two watersheds is pretty nasty and long and confusing. More likely is a different route that I will show here in a little bit. But the fact remains, he was on Lake Huron, and the next thing you know, he's on the west shore of Lake Michigan. He followed the shore back to the Mattawa and the French back to Montreal. So he is basically the first European to go inland in the Great Lakes area, Michigan specifically. So Radisson and Groseilliers, they paired up, and they had this huge adventure where they left Montreal and they came into the Great Lakes. If you read his biography, read the notes, there's a lot of information about his trips. We are not sure how much of it's true, where he exactly was. There's even stories of him going all the way up to James Bay, going on the Mississippi River. The thing is, there were no maps back then, and we're just going on, what he's being told and what he writes down. And then, of course, he writes his biography years later. And he's French, and he wrote his biography in English. So I'm sure there was some issues with translation. But in any case, these guys explored a ton with the French, and they are also the founders of the Hudson Bay Company. And then that's when the French was really turning their interest over from trying to find this Northwest Passage to bring furs back to Europe. With Radisson and Groseilliers, Father Rene Menard tagged along with him, and he ended up being abandoned in today's Lens in the winter of 1660 and 1661, making him the first Jesuit to overwinter in Michigan. He's probably the first European to do so as well. And he basically had his a subsistence existence. He's very cold. He was eating terribly. He basically barely survived the winter, where the next year he was on his way to find some exiled Huron Indians living on the Chippewa River in Wisconsin. So he'd heard this story about these starving Chippewa, and he decided in the spring, I'm going to go find these guys and bring them resources and save their souls. So he waited until the ice was gone on the in the Great Lakes, or inland too, because we're not exactly sure of his route that he took to find these Chippewa. So there's several prevailing theories on what route he took. There's actually a hiking trail that goes from Lens to Lac Vieux Desert. And then there's also a hike paddle portage route that goes through Lake Gogebic. And another one is that he may have paddled Lake Superior to Chequamegon and then paddled inland. We really don't know. There's even a theory that says he didn't even stay in Lens. He was over at Chequamegon. So I think this is going to be one lost to history, since they weren't really taking notes back in the day. And like I said, no maps or anything. But if you read all the various stories, I came up basically what I think is the probably what happened, because I feel he stayed in Lens just based on the descriptions of the lake and everything in his notes, and the yellow dot with the red X, that's where he was, and then the bottom left you see the blue dot with the X, that's where he ended up. So if you look here, there's actually there's Lac Vieux Desert is right here, and there's actually a trail that comes down here, and there's actually a portage and a route through rivers to come to Lac Vieux Desert. The Wisconsin River watershed actually goes right along the lake, or it goes right along the Upper Peninsula Wisconsin border, and Lac Vieux Desert is actually in the Wisconsin River watershed. And if you look at some maps, you can see it's not out of the realm of possibility. He could have canoed down there as well, although there was a path, and he could have probably walked it as well. So there's the route that I think has the best chance of him taking to get to this settlement. This is the other route, because there's also mention of portages, and there's a portage that used to be right here. If you go up to the Keweenaw today, you can put a boat right through there, because it was a lake and it had a little tiny little chunk of land, and they actually removed that so you could actually paddle through both. So he could have done any one of these routes. We're really not sure what he did, because another route is going to the Montreal River and going upstream of the Montreal, which is a very long portage there to get to the Wisconsin settlement that where these Hurons were staying. So this one is steeped in mystery. Folks in Wisconsin love talking about this in the canoe community, because I don't think we'll ever know what ever happened to Rene Menard. So look at some trails. So there is actually an atlas by Hinman, Hinman, and he put together an archaeological atlas of Michigan, which has Native American trails, portages, burial sites, cities, and things like that. And this book goes over 100 years old. And if you look at it and you look at the maps, you'll see what look like today's, for example, US 31. So, or, this is a Lakeshore Drive right here. So a lot of our roads kind of parallel where these pathways were, because it probably went from a pathway to a road to what we have today. So here's that Lockview to Lance Trail. This connects the Lake Superior and Mississippi watersheds. This was a very important trail. They would come up the Mississippi, and then they would hit this trail, and then they'd be on Lake Superior. Let's see. So here is another one. This is the Dinak Trail. The Dinak Trail goes from Munising, and actually today it's a rapid river truck trail for the most part. This is actually established this as a hiking trail, and I've actually hiked this. So you can actually hike the Dinak Trail. The Lockview Trail also was actually used by Native Americans up until the 1940s, and there are still chunks of it left. And before my big move overseas, that was one thing I really wanted to do, is hike the Lockview Trail from Lockview Desert all the way up to Lance. But unfortunately, COVID and other things prevented me from doing that. We'll save that for another day. So this was another major trail that connected between Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, was the Dinak Trail. There's also the Whitefish River and the Autrain River, which I'll cover here in a second. So it parallels this river, and I'll tell you why that is here in a second. Here's another one you can read about. Peter White and Bishop Baraga actually used this trail. This was a route between Marquette and Escanaba. So when Marquette was settled, Lake Superior would freeze in, and they would actually have to take dog sled teams and bring the mail and supplies up to Marquette before the railroad came. So this was a very important trail for folks that first settled in Marquette. All right, some portages. What are portages? Well, we should look and think of them in terms of why are you portaging? You portage across and between watersheds, and you got everything from continental watersheds like the Atlantic Ocean to the Arctic Ocean. You got subwatersheds, like I showed, like between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi, Great Lakes watersheds between the various Great Lakes. River watersheds and tributaries, probably the more commonly used ones. So going from a river flowing into the Lake Michigan to a river that's flowing into Saginaw Bay, for example. Around rapids and falls like Tequamanon, and then between lakes as well. So these portages have been used for thousands of years by Native Americans for various reasons, but this is what they're portaging between. So here is a map of Michigan's rivers. You can see down here the Grand, the Kalamazoo, the St. Joseph, and the Raisin, and this is also part of this, I think the Maumee down here, all come really close to each other. So this you would think would be a very, very popular area to portage between, but I'm showing not much information by this area being used for portaging. So a major portage in the Great Lakes area is down in South Bend, and this is between the St. Joseph River and the Kankakee. Now, the Kankakee eventually ends up in the Mississippi River. So this was first traversed by the Europeans by La Salle in 1679. Charlevoix also used this route. And you can see come down the St. Joseph River, and there was a bend they looked for, and then they kind of shot across down to this Kankakee Marsh, and they would basically drag their canoes until the water was deep enough, and then they'd start floating. The thing is a lot of these areas now have been ditched, diked, and drained, so the water level is a lot lower, and you just aren't able to, portage these anymore because of the manipulation that man has done to the landscape. But here's what it looked like going down the hill from the St. Joseph River towards the Kankakee. He actually went up and over a hill. This is what it looks like today. It's just a sign. That's all they got there is where LaSalle's Portage is. So a Lake Huron to Lake Michigan portage, and this is going back to what I was saying about Groseillier. The most likely portage he used was this one. So this is part of the Tittabawassee River. It ends up here. Here's the Bad River, and it ends, and then there is a tributary of the Maple that comes up to the Pine Creek. And right here. So you have two river watersheds. Now, this is very agricultural area these days. But back in the day, the water table was a lot higher. This was marshier. And you'll see here in a second, it's probably relatively easy. So here's today's map. Here is the old riverbed. And then it is a relatively flat walk for half a mile to get back into the watershed. And away you go. So this was probably a marsh at one time until it was drained. And so that's a half-mile portage. So if you think about it, why monkey around trying to find your way between the Huron and the Grand when I can just paddle up into the Saginaw Bay or cut across Lake Superior, go up the Tittabawassee, find this point, and then bam, I'm in the Grand River watershed, and away I go. So this is one I would love to try. It looks pretty easy. These are drainage ditches now. So I could see somebody plowing and their fields, and paddle up with a kayak, hop out, walk half a mile, put it back in, and away you go. So that's what it looks like today. This is probably marshland back in the day. So I had mentioned the Whitefish River and Autrain rivers. Those paralleled the Dinak Trail. The theory is the Native Americans would paddle up the Autrain because it was slow and lazy, and then they would portage over to the Whitefish, which was fast, and they would go downstream. Coming the other way, it was difficult to paddle up the Whitefish, so they would hoof it, and that's how the trail got started. And of course, you'll have probably natives that didn't have canoes, and they just hoof the trail. And it's about a 1 to 2 day walk, and it's some people say they can paddle the whole thing in 2 days. So it's a quick way to get across between Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. This is the original survey map from back in the day. And you see this line right here. This is a dividing line between the two. You can see the river's actually connected. Top of this line, that's going towards Lake Superior. This creek was in a large wetland complex, and they actually connected. You didn't even have to get out of your canoe to portage across. So you can see why this would be a popular place. And this is what it looks like today. So what ended up happening is they end up building a reservoir for hydro. It's now the Cleveland Cliffs Basin. This dotted line is the Dinak Trail. And where that arrow is, that is a giant berm. This water wants to flow south. And what's happening is it's percolating up down here. You can see this little lake. Water's actually flowing up into there. So you could actually paddle the Autrain. You have to go around the Autrain Dam. You get on this basin. You go all the way here. You climb up and over a berm. And this is a really soupy area. What I would do is I would actually walk the berm, and there's a little road, a little path, and then come back down. I actually paddled upstream, and I got to about this lake, and it was muck soup. There's no way you could walk in this stuff. So my recommendation is anybody does this, you go to the berm and just go around. It's not that far. It's like maybe 3/4 of a mile. Then you're on Trout Lake, which is the Laughing Whitefish, and south you go. So there are trails that I mentioned that are, basically today's highways. The highways themselves, are not literally right on top of the old trail. Think of it as more of a corridor. They're nearby where it used to run. Probably the closest one is the Sauk Trail to the original trail. So when US 12 was being built, the Sauk Trail was a wagon route between Chicago and Detroit. course, these engineers go out there and they think they know better, and they get out there and they start engineering, and they're like, you know what? These Native Americans knew what they were doing. They found every little way to get around things and around wetlands and lakes, and they just pretty much left it be. And when you drive US 12, you're pretty much on the old Native American trail, the old Sauk Trail. That goes through there. And that actually is thought to be an old buffalo trail. The bison used to come into Michigan. They think it came up on that trail. It was originally a buffalo or bison trail. All right, so who portages between watersheds anymore? I'll tell you what, I spent lots of time on forums and Facebook groups asking these canoers, hey, who here is portage between two watersheds? And I'd rattle off watersheds. And I'm here to tell you, not a single person came out and told me. And then somebody said, hey, Tom, you know what? Us recreational canoers, we don't want to go around obstacles. We want the easiest way possible. So, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. You know, we want an easy trip. There's no reason for us to portage between watersheds. We're mostly out there to, have a little fun. But there are some easy ones to do. This is one that's very easy to do. This is actually the Fox River on the left, and this is a little tributary, and it comes up to basically a landing, and then there's a path, then it goes on to a little road, and then right there's the Tequamanon, 1.2 miles. And this was a route used by Native Americans, so they didn't have to go through the Straits of Mackinac to get up to Whitefish Point or the St. Mary's River. So other ones are easy to do. There's the Ossawa Muskegon. The Grand Huron is one I've mentioned. There's been a few people that have done it. Hugh Heward was one. It took him like 12 days to portage this thing because it was such a nightmare for him. And then most recently, Verlin Kruger, who was an avid canoer back here in like I think the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He actually portaged that using Hugh Heward's notes. So that was pretty cool. All right, there's a lot of sources out there. I mentioned this book by Hinsdale, Wilbur Hinsdale, Archaeological Atlas of Michigan. A great book is Henry Schoolcraft's Narrative Journal. There's all kinds of information out there. If you can get your hands on it, Jim Woodruff's Locating Michigan's Old Canoe Portages is a great unpublished but found in local libraries. And then, of course, looking at your General Land Office maps, which are all online, are great resources. So this project will continue. And as I continue to plug away on this, I'll put stories up on my podcast, which is Tom's Trail Tales. Tom's Trail Tales is my Facebook page, and I do a podcast called Tom's Trail Tales. It's on Podbean, Google, it's on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and all that. So I tell stories about brulee and things like that. So that's kind of a cool thing. And then subscribe to this video. Just down here, click on or subscribe to my page. Just go down here, click on subscribe, and I'll be adding more content as we go along. So thanks a lot for joining me today. This is Tom Funk, and this was Almost Forgotten Paddles, Portages, and Pathways of the Great Lakes. Thanks for joining me. Happy trails.